The year was 632 C, the 10th year after the migration. From every corner of Arabia, they began to move across the vast Arabian sands, not as enemies but as brothers in faith, not as tribes but as one single people, moving together toward a shared destination. Just years earlier, this unity was impossible, living under the shadow of hardship and secret prayer. Arabia was once divided by blood, now it was united by belief. And at the center of it all was a man who had changed everything, the Prophet of God, Muhammad, peace be upon him. This would be his final journey. But what he would say would echo for centuries.
The year is 622 AD. In the desert city of Mecca, a small group of believers followed a new message called Islam. For more than 13 years, they faced persecution, violence, and exile. Some were beaten, some were imprisoned. Others were forced to leave their homes, yet their faith continued to grow. Soon, a single journey across the Arabian desert would change the course of history forever. The leaders of Mecca saw the new religion as a threat to their power. Muslims were boycotted and attacked. Life in Mecca became increasingly dangerous. Some believers had already migrated to the kingdom of Abyssinia, seeking safety. But the Prophet of Islam remained in Mecca, continuing to preach the message despite the growing danger. Eventually, staying in the city was no longer possible. Far to the north, the city of Medina had heard about the message of Islam. Several tribes from Medina met the Prophet during pilgrimage seasons in Mecca. After hearing the message, they accepted Islam. They invited him to come to their city, and they promised protection. This invitation would lead to one of the most important journeys in history.
One night, the Prophet secretly left Mecca with his companion, Abu Bakr, for a journey that would change history.
Their destination was the city of Medina.
They traveled across 450 kilometers of harsh desert, pursued by search parties sent by the leaders of Mecca. To escape capture, they hid in the cave of Thor. Pursuers came so close that only a miracle stood between them and discovery. According to authentic Sunni narrations, a spider web and a nesting bird convinced the searchers the cave was abandoned.
At that tense moment, Abu Bakr feared they might be discovered.
After 3 days, the journey continued.
When the Prophet arrived in Medina, the city welcomed him with joy. People gathered to greet the new arrivals. For the first time, Muslims were not a persecuted minority. They were now a community with a home. This historic migration became known as the Hijrah, and it marks the beginning of year 1 in the Islamic calendar. One of the first actions in Medina was building a mosque. This mosque would become known as Al-Masjid an-Nabawi, but it was more than a place of prayer. It was a center for learning, leadership, and community life. The migrants from Mecca were also paired with residents of Medina in a system of brotherhood. This helped strengthen the new society. To organize the growing city, an important agreement was established. This agreement became known as the Constitution of Medina. It created cooperation between Muslims and other communities living in the city. It defined rights, responsibilities, and mutual defense. Many historians consider it one of the earliest written political agreements in history. What began as a quiet migration through the desert would soon reshape the world. Within only a few decades, Muslim armies would confront two of the most powerful empires of the time, the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire. A new civilization was beginning to rise. Every civilization has a moment when everything begins. For Islamic history, that moment was the Hijrah.
What began as a quiet journey through the dunes would soon reshape the entire world forever.
And from that single journey across the desert, a civilization would rise that would shape world history for more than 1,000 years. Upon arrival, the Prophet and his companions were warmly welcomed by the people of Medina. The city had heard of the message and opened its arms. One of the first steps was building a mosque, Al-Masjid an-Nabawi. It served as a center for prayer, learning, and leadership. The mosque quickly became the heart of the community. Here people gathered to learn, discuss, and make decisions. Migrants from Mecca were paired with Medinan residents, forging bonds of brotherhood to strengthen the community. Daily life flourished. Marketplaces buzzed. Teaching sessions started across the city, and communal gatherings strengthened ties. These first steps in Medina marked the beginning of a thriving community, united by faith, cooperation, and knowledge. To organize the growing city, the Prophet established an important agreement. This agreement became known as the Constitution of Medina. It defined the rights and responsibilities of the Muslim community and other residents. Mutual defense and cooperation were guaranteed to protect the city. Despite peace agreements, minor conflicts arose that tested the new society. Leaders guided the community to resolve disputes fairly. Education and knowledge sharing were central to the community. People gathered in mosques and homes to study and discuss faith and laws. Brotherhood ties between Meccan migrants and Medinan residents strengthened. Shared meals, celebrations, and daily chores built trust and unity. The marketplace became the center of trade, conversation, and social life. Merchants, travelers, and locals interacted peacefully, guided by fairness. Together, they created the foundations of a lasting society. Community leaders resolved conflicts with wisdom and patience. Justice and fairness were emphasized to maintain harmony. Festivals and communal prayers brought people together. These early steps sowed the seeds of a civilization that would grow beyond Medina. Trade flourished, knowledge spread, and the community expanded. Arts, learning, and craftsmanship developed within the peaceful society. The mosque continued to serve as the center for education and guidance. Families and neighbors helped one another, creating a tight-knit society. Together, they overcame challenges and grew stronger with every trial. From these small beginnings, the first Muslim society emerged. The Constitution and the bonds of brotherhood would guide generations to come. And thus a society was born, a community of faith, justice, and unity. 2 years after the migration from Mecca to Medina, the Muslim community had begun to establish itself as a small but organized society. The migrants from Mecca, known as the Muhajirun, had left behind their homes, wealth, and property. Many of their possessions had been seized by the Quraysh, the powerful tribe that controlled Mecca. Although the Muslims had found safety in Medina, the tension between the two sides had not ended. The leaders of Mecca still saw the new Muslim community as a threat to their power and influence in Arabia. In the year 624 CE, news reached Medina that a large Quraysh trade caravan was returning from Syria back to Mecca. These caravans were vital to the economy of the Quraysh. They carried goods, textiles, spices, and wealth. This particular caravan was led by Abu Sufyan ibn Harb, one of the most influential leaders of Mecca. Some of the wealth was believed to include property that had originally belonged to the Muslims who had been forced to leave. When the news reached Medina, the Prophet Muhammad decided to send a small group to intercept the caravan. The goal was not to begin a major battle, but rather to reclaim some of the wealth that had been taken. Around 313 Muslims joined the expedition. They were lightly equipped and not fully prepared for a large military confrontation. The group had only a few horses and a limited number of camels, which the men shared during the long journey. Abu Sufyan learned that a Muslim group was moving toward him. He quickly sent a messenger to Mecca asking for immediate help. The Quraysh responded by assembling a large army. Nearly 1,000 warriors gathered for the march. Many of the most powerful leaders of Mecca joined the force, determined to defend their caravan. Eventually, the two sides moved toward a small desert area known as Badr. The location was famous for its wells. Control of these wells would prove strategically important. According to historical sources, the Muslim forces reached the area first and positioned themselves near the water sources. The Battle of Badr began with traditional duels between warriors from both sides. Soon afterward, the confrontation expanded into a full battle across the open desert plain. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the Muslim fighters held their ground against a much larger army. As the battle continued, the tide gradually shifted. Several key leaders of the Quraysh were killed. In the end, the battle concluded with an unexpected victory for the Muslim forces. Many were captured, others retreated. The outcome of Badr sent shockwaves across the Arabian Peninsula. A small community had defeated one of the most powerful tribal forces. For the Muslims, the victory strengthened their position and boosted morale. For the Quraysh, it was a turning point. The Battle of Badr would later be remembered as one of the defining moments of early Islamic history. The story of this community was beginning to influence the course of history, far beyond the desert city where it began.
After the unexpected victory at Badr, the leaders of Mecca were humiliated. Many of their chiefs had been killed, and their prestige among the tribes of Arabia was shaken. But the defeat did not end the conflict. Instead, it ignited a deep desire for revenge. In Mecca, the leaders of Quraysh began preparing for another confrontation. Led by Abu Sufyan, they gathered allies from surrounding tribes and raised a powerful army. Their goal was clear: march to Medina and crush the growing Muslim community. In the third year after the Hijrah, nearly 3,000 warriors set out from Mecca. Among them were hundreds of cavalry and experienced fighters determined to avenge the defeat at Badr. Dust rose across the desert as the army marched north toward Medina. When news reached the city, the Prophet Muhammad gathered the companions to discuss how the city should be defended. Some advised remaining within Medina's streets. Others believed they should face the enemy outside. After consultation, the decision was made to meet the Meccan army in the open field. The Muslim army marched north and positioned themselves near the slopes of Mount Uhud. The mountain stood like a natural wall behind them, protecting their rear. Before them stretched the plains. To protect the army's flank, the Prophet placed 50 archers on a nearby hill overlooking the field. Their instructions were clear. No matter what happened in the battle below, they were not to leave their position. When the battle began, the Muslim forces advanced with determination. Despite being heavily outnumbered, their lines held firm. Gradually, the Meccan army began to retreat across the field. For a moment, it appeared that victory might come again. As the enemy lines fell back, some archers believed the battle was won. Seeing spoils below, many left their posts. But the hill had been the key to protecting the army's flank. Watching from the field was Khalid ibn al-Walid. The moment he saw the hill unprotected, he seized the opportunity. He led a swift cavalry charge around the field. He struck from behind, and the sudden attack changed the course of the battle. Confusion spread. What had seemed like victory only moments earlier turned into a desperate struggle. Among those who fell was Hamza ibn Abd al-Muttalib, the uncle of the Prophet. His courage would be remembered throughout history. Gradually, the Muslim fighters regrouped and withdrew toward the rocky slopes of Mount Uhud. There, the terrain protected them from further cavalry attacks. The fighting slowly came to an end. When the battle ended, 70 companions had been martyred. For the community, the losses were painful. The battlefield of Uhud became a powerful reminder of both courage and hardship. The events carried a profound lesson. Victory was not guaranteed by strength or numbers alone. It required unity, discipline, and unwavering obedience. These lessons would shape the future of the Muslim community. The struggle was far from over. Soon, an even greater challenge would arrive, one that would test the survival of the entire city. The year was 5 AH. The young city of Medina had endured the shock of Uhud, but a far greater storm was now forming across the deserts of Arabia. The Quraysh of Mecca, determined to eliminate the Muslim community once and for all, began forging alliances on an unprecedented scale. They reached out to powerful tribes, the Ghatafan, the exiled Banu Nadir, and many others, binding them together in a single massive coalition. This coalition became known as Al-Asab, the Confederates. Nearly 10,000 warriors gathered beneath their banners. In Arabia, 1,000 fighters was considered a formidable army. 10,000 was something closer to a storm of steel. Led by Abu Sufyan, the alliance represented the combined power of many tribes. Their goal was clear: to surround Medina and erase the Muslim community from the map of Arabia. News of their march spread rapidly across the desert, reaching Medina just days before the first banners appeared on the horizon. Inside Medina, tension filled the air. The city was naturally protected on three sides by rugged volcanic rock and thick palm groves. But the northern approach remained dangerously open. During the Shura, the consultative council, a companion from distant lands spoke with a remarkable idea. Salman al-Farisi, who had traveled from Persia in search of truth, suggested a defensive strategy unfamiliar to the Arabs: a trench. The task was enormous. They had less than a week. Men worked day and night, carving a massive trench into the rocky desert soil. The Prophet himself joined the labor, carrying stones and digging beside his companions. The workers recited poetry as they toiled against the cold winds. The trench would stretch for kilometers, nearly 5 meters wide and deep enough to stop even the strongest warhorse. It was the city's final shield. Soon, the horizon darkened. 10,000 warriors approached Medina. But as the Meccan cavalry reached the northern plain, they stopped. Where they expected open ground for a charge, there was a chasm. The generals of the Quraysh stared in disbelief. The siege of Medina had begun. Days stretched into weeks. The siege tested the endurance of Medina's people. Food grew scarce. Some tied stones to their stomachs to dull the pain of hunger. At the same time, troubling news arrived. Rumors spread that the Banu Qurayza might break their treaty. Hearts reached the throats. Eventually, a small group of Meccan champions found a narrow crossing. Among them was Amr ibn Abd Wud, a warrior whose reputation echoed across Arabia. He challenged the Muslims to single combat. From the ranks stepped Ali ibn Abi Talib. In a brief clash, the Meccan champion fell. The breach collapsed. After nearly 27 days, the turning point arrived, not through battle, but through the desert itself. A fierce wind swept across the plain. It tore through the Confederate camp, toppling tents and extinguishing fires. In the chaos, suspicion spread. Fear replaced confidence. By morning, the great army was gone. The coalition had dissolved in the night. Abu Sufyan ordered a full retreat into the desert. The Prophet remarked that from that day forward, the Quraysh would no longer march against Medina. The initiative was now with the Muslims. The Battle of the Trench demonstrated the power of unity, strategy, and faith under pressure. The greatest coalition had failed. And for the first time, the road to Mecca no longer seemed impossible. But the next chapter would not begin with war. Instead, it would begin with a peace agreement that would reshape the future of Islam. The year is 6 after the Hijrah. The dust of the Battle of the Trench has barely settled, but the hearts of the Muslims in Medina still long for their sacred home in Mecca. For 6 years, the Muhajirun have lived in exile, yearning to return to the Kaaba. One night, the Prophet Muhammad saw a vision. He saw himself and his companions entering the Masjid al-Haram, performing the rites of pilgrimage, their heads shaved, their hearts at peace. This vision was not merely a dream, it was a sign from Allah.
لقد صدق الله رسوله الرؤيا بالحق لتدخلن المسجد الحرام إن شاء الله آمنين محلقين رؤوسكم ومقصرين لا تخافون فعلم ما لم تعلموا فجعل من دون ذلك فتحا قريبا.
Believing in this divine guidance, he called upon the believers to join him on a peaceful pilgrimage, not a march of war. Around 1,400 men and women answered the call. At Dhul Hulayfa, they donned the simple white garments of ihram, sheathed their swords, and prepared their animals for sacrifice, their voices rising across the desert, Labbaik Allahumma labbaik. They did not set out as an army. They set out as pilgrims in faith, carrying only the weapons of travelers, trusting that Allah would open the way. But word of this great caravan reached Mecca. To the Quraysh, allowing it through meant admitting Muslim strength. To attack pilgrims in ihram meant breaking the sanctity of the sacred months. They chose a third path, to block the way. Khalid ibn al-Walid was sent with 200 cavalry to intercept the Muslims at Usfan, placing a wall of steel between them and the sacred city. Rather than break the sanctity of the sacred months with battle, the Prophet diverted the caravan along rugged mountain paths, guided by one who knew the hidden ways. At last, they reached the plain of Hudaybiyyah, just outside the sacred boundary of Mecca. There, the Prophet's camel, Qaswa, knelt and would not rise. He told the companions this was a sign from Allah, that here they should stop and wait. The well at Hudaybiyyah was nearly dry and 1,400 souls needed water. By the permission of Allah, when the Prophet placed an arrow in that well, its water rose and flowed, quenching the thirst of the entire camp. The Quraysh sent envoys to test the Muslims. They found no army preparing for conquest, only pilgrims in ihram, disciplined and calm, waiting for the house of Allah to be opened to them. Urwa ibn Mas'ud, a respected Meccan, watched as the companions gathered around their Prophet. He saw them lower their voices, hasten to follow his command, and cherish even the water of his ablution. He returned to Mecca saying he had never seen any ruler so honored by his people. To further clarify their peaceful intent, the Prophet sent Uthman ibn Affan into Mecca, trusting in his ties and respect among the Quraysh. Days passed without word. Then a chilling rumor swept through the camp. Uthman had been killed. The companions felt the weight of war closing in once more. In response, the Prophet gathered his companions beneath the shade of a great tree and called for a pledge to stand firm and not flee, whatever might come. They placed their hands in his and in each other's, pledging their lives and loyalty, a pledge that Allah Himself would later praise in Surah Al-Fath.
لقد رضي الله عن المؤمنين إذ يبايعونك تحت الشجرة فعلم ما في قلوبهم فأنزل السكينة عليهم وأثابهم فتحا قريبا.
Soon after, Uthman returned alive. The rumor had been false, but the pledge under the tree revealed the strength and unity of the believers' hearts. Finally, the Quraysh sent Suhail ibn Amr, a seasoned negotiator, to agree on terms that would protect Meccan pride while avoiding war. Even the opening lines of the treaty were contested. Suhail objected to the words Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and the title Messenger of Allah, insisting on older Meccan formulas instead. For the sake of peace, the Prophet agreed to these changes. He chose the substance of the agreement over titles, trusting that honor lies with Allah, not with human labels. Yet the clauses were difficult. The Muslims would return to Medina without performing pilgrimage that year. Any Meccan who embraced Islam and fled to Medina would be sent back, while any Muslim who defected to Mecca could stay. Then, in chains and exhausted, Abu Jandal, the son of Suhail himself, staggered into the Muslim camp seeking refuge. Because the ink was barely dry on the treaty, the Prophet returned him, asking him to be patient and trust in Allah's plan. Some companions, like Umar ibn al-Khattab, struggled to accept what felt like humiliation. Abu Bakr reassured them, "He is the messenger of Allah, and Allah will never abandon him." Following the Prophet's example, they sacrificed their animals and shaved their heads, ending the state of Ihram without entering Mecca. The act of obedience eased the weight on their hearts. On the journey back to Medina, the air of disappointment still lingered, until a new revelation descended, reshaping their understanding of what had just occurred. "Indeed, we have given you a clear victory," Allah declared in Surah Al-Fath.
إنا فتحنا لك فتحا مبينا.
What had looked like retreat was, in truth, the opening of a door long closed. In the 2 years of peace that followed, more people entered Islam than in all the years of open conflict combined. Dawah could now travel safely across the peninsula. The Treaty of Hudaybiyyah proved that patience, faith, and wise diplomacy can achieve victories greater than the sword. What seemed like a setback was, in reality, a divine triumph. The year is 7 AH. A fragile peace has settled over Arabia following the historic Treaty of Hudaybiyyah. For the first time in years, the southern frontier toward Mecca is quiet. But beyond the northern lava plains lies another power, one that had long supported the enemies of the Muslims. 90 miles north of Medina stood the oasis of Khaybar. Rich with palm groves and fertile fields, Khaybar was protected by massive fortresses built upon black volcanic rock. From these strongholds, alliances were formed and plans were made against Medina. Now that peace had been secured in the south, the Prophet Muhammad turned his attention north. The threat of Khaybar could no longer remain. The Messenger of Allah calls upon the companions who had pledged loyalty beneath the tree at Hudaybiyyah.
لقد رضي الله عن المؤمنين إذ يبايعونك تحت الشجرة فعلم ما في قلوبهم فأنزل السكينة عليهم وأثابهم فتحا قريبا.
Nearly 1,400 believers answer the call. They march not as conquerors, but with quiet discipline. Their path leads through the harsh volcanic lands known as the Hijrah, where jagged rocks and narrow valleys make travel slow and dangerous. To maintain surprise, they avoid the open roads. The journey continues silently under the desert stars. Eventually, the army reaches the valley approaching Khaybar. As dawn approaches, the Muslims pause. In the cool gray light of morning, they stand together and pray Fajr. A new chapter of history is about to begin. As the people of Khaybar leave their homes for the morning harvest, they suddenly see the Muslim army standing across the palm groves. Panic spreads through the oasis. They rush toward their fortresses shouting warnings. The Prophet Muhammad watches the scene and proclaims, "Allahu Akbar, Khaybar is destroyed." Khaybar was not a single fortress. It was a network of powerful strongholds, among them the fortresses of Na'im, al-Sab, and the formidable al-Qamus. The siege begins. Days turn into weeks. The Muslims advance slowly from fortress to fortress. The defenders rely on thick gates, high towers, and stores of grain and water. The struggle becomes a test of patience and endurance. The Muslims face not only the high walls, but the elements and the long duration of the campaign.
يا أيها الذين آمنوا إن تنصروا الله ينصركم ويثبت أقدامكم.
One evening, during the difficult siege, the Prophet makes a remarkable announcement. Tomorrow I will give the banner to a man who loves Allah and His Messenger, and Allah and His Messenger love him. The next morning, the Prophet asks for Ali ibn Abi Talib. Ali steps forward, suffering from an infection in his eyes. The Prophet prays for him, and immediately the pain disappears. Ali carries the banner forward. The Prophet tells him, "Advance calmly and invite them to Islam. If Allah guides even one man through you, it is better for you than possessing red camels." Soon the final confrontations begin. Among the defenders emerges a renowned warrior named Marhab. Ali meets him. In a decisive duel, Marhab is defeated. The gates of the final fortresses begin to fall. The legend of Ali's strength at the gates of Khaybar would be told for centuries to come. Victory was near. With their defenses broken, the leaders of Khaybar seek peace. They propose an agreement to cultivate the land they know so well, giving half the harvest to the community in Medina. The Prophet Muhammad accepts. The oasis is secured. But the victory of Khaybar is more than a military triumph.
ومغانم كثيرة يأخذونها وكان الله عزيزا حكيما وعدكم الله مغانم كثيرة تأخذونها فعجل لكم هذه وكف أيدي الناس عنكم ولتكون آية للمؤمنين ويهديكم صراطا مستقيما.
It transforms a center of hostility into a source of provision. As the Muslims return to Medina, another joyful moment awaits them. The long-absent migrants who had taken refuge in Abyssinia finally return, led by Ja'far ibn Abi Talib. The Prophet says, "I do not know which makes me happier, the victory of Khaybar or the arrival of Ja'far." The Muslim community has entered a new phase of strength. The northern frontier is secure, and the path toward the next great chapter, the return to Mecca, has begun. In the 8th year after the Hijrah, Medina was no longer just a sanctuary. It was the heart of a growing community, radiating faith and purpose across the sands of Arabia. A single rider, Al-Harith ibn Umayr al-Azdi, was dispatched north. He was not a soldier of war, but a carrier of a message, addressed to the ruler of Busra under the Byzantine Empire. When he reached the territory of the Ghassanids, his sacred immunity as an envoy was shattered. Shurabil ibn Amr committed a crime that declared war against the laws of nations. The envoy was bound and executed. This was the only known messenger of the Prophet to be killed, a violation of the ancient desert code that could not go unanswered. When the news reached Medina, the atmosphere changed instantly. The community understood the gravity of the moment. Justice required a response that would reach the very borders of the empire. The Prophet called for an expedition. 3,000 men answered. It was the largest force they had ever assembled, a testament to the weight of the mission ahead. As horses were prepared and blades sharpened, the focus was not on conquest, but on the defense of the sanctity of human life and the message they carried. The Prophet gave clear instructions. Do not kill a woman, a child, or the elderly. Do not destroy homes. Do not cut down trees. Even in the face of murder, justice had strict limits. 3 commanders were appointed, Zayd ibn Haritha, then Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, and finally Abdullah ibn Rawaha. 3 banners for a journey into the unknown. The army set out, marching farther north than any force from Medina had ever traveled. They moved with a quiet discipline that echoed across the vast plains of the Hijaz. They passed beyond the familiar lands of Arabia and reached the region of Ma'an. There, scouts returned with news that would test the heart of every man present. They were not facing a tribal garrison. Reports spoke of tens of thousands, Byzantine soldiers and their allies. 3,000 were facing a storm of steel. For a moment, uncertainty spread. Some suggested waiting for reinforcements, but one voice rose above the doubt, the voice of the poet-warrior, Abdullah ibn Rawaha. "We do not fight by numbers or strength," he reminded them. We fight with this religion that Allah has honored us with." The decision was made to advance. The armies met near the village of Mu'tah. The battle began with a ferocity that shook the desert. Zayd ibn Haritha was the first to carry the banner into the storm. For years, Zayd had been among the closest to the Prophet. He advanced without hesitation, leading the charge into the heart of the Byzantine ranks. Amidst the chaos of swords and shields, Zayd fell. The banner dropped, but the spirit of the army remained unbroken as the next commander rushed forward. Ja'far ibn Abi Talib lifted the banner. He dismounted his horse to fight on foot, showing a bravery that would be immortalized in history. He fought until his last breath. The banner fell once more as Ja'far joined his brother Zayd among the martyrs. The weight of the battlefield now fell upon the shoulders of Abdullah ibn Rawaha. Reminding himself of the promise of the hereafter, Abdullah charged. He too fell, and for a heartbeat, the fate of the 3,000 hung in the balance. In that moment of crisis, the companions turned to Khalid ibn al-Walid. He took the banner and immediately reorganized the lines. 9 swords would break in his hands that day. Khalid understood that direct victory was impossible. During the night, he devised a masterpiece of strategy, shifting the wings and the rear to create the illusion of reinforcements. When the enemy awoke, they saw new faces and heard unfamiliar cries. Fearing a massive reinforcement, they hesitated, allowing Khalid to execute a disciplined withdrawal. While the battle raged hundreds of miles away, the Prophet sat among his companions in Medina, describing the battle as though it were unfolding before his very eyes. "Zayd has been martyred," he said. Then Ja'far, then Abdullah. He wept for his brothers, then his face brightened. Then the banner was taken by one of the swords of Allah. From that day forward, Khalid ibn al-Walid was known as Saifullah, the sword of Allah. Mu'tah was a turning point that would echo through the ages. 3 commanders had fallen, but their sacrifice forged a path into the north. Medina was now a power that the great empires of the world would soon have to recognize. The expedition was complete, the community was stronger, and the road toward the greatest event in Islamic history, the return to Mecca, had truly begun. For 8 long years, the horizon of Mecca remained a distant memory for the believers. They had been driven out under the cover of night, leaving behind their wealth, their homes, and the graves of their ancestors. They were outcasts, labeled as rebels by the powerful Quraysh, but the desert remembers. In the 8th year after the Hijrah, the sands began to tremble. A force of 10,000 men, the largest army ever assembled in the Hijaz, was marching. There was no beating of drums, no songs of war, only the rhythmic thud of boots and the whispered prayers of men returning home. This wasn't just a conquest of land, it was the fulfillment of a divine promise. This is the story of the Fath al-Makkah, the conquest of Mecca. 2 years earlier, a fragile peace had been established between the Muslims of Medina and the leaders of Mecca. This agreement became known as the Treaty of Hudaybiyyah. The treaty was meant to last 10 years. But in Arabia, old tribal rivalries were never easily forgotten. One night, the tribe of Banu Bakr, allies of Quraysh, launched a surprise attack against their rivals, the Banu Khuza'ah, who were allied with the Muslims. The attack was brutal. Men were killed even within the sacred sanctuary where fighting was forbidden. Some members of Quraysh secretly supplied weapons and horses to the attackers. With this act, the treaty had been broken. One of the leaders of Khuza'ah, Amr ibn Salim, rode across the desert to Medina seeking justice. Standing before Prophet Muhammad, he recited poetry describing the betrayal. The Prophet listened carefully. Then he answered with calm certainty, "You will be helped, O Amr ibn Salim." The treaty was over. The path toward Mecca had begun. The Prophet began preparing a massive expedition. But this time, secrecy was essential. Even many of his closest companions did not know the destination. He prayed that the Quraysh would remain unaware until the army reached their gates. During this preparation, an unexpected incident occurred. A companion named Hatib ibn Abi Balta'a attempted to send a secret letter to Mecca warning them of the approaching army. Hatib feared for his family living in Mecca. But the message was intercepted before it reached the city. Some companions demanded severe punishment, yet the Prophet remembered something important. Hatib had fought in the historic Battle of Badr. Because of this, the Prophet forgave him. Even before the conquest began, mercy had already appeared. Soon, the army began its journey. 10,000 men marched from Medina toward Mecca. The desert horizon was filled with the scale of the community's return. As the army approached the valley outside Mecca, night fell. The prophet then gave an unusual command. Every soldier was instructed to light a fire. Soon, 10,000 flames illuminated the desert hills. From a distance, the valley looked like a sky filled with stars. Inside Mecca, the Quraysh watched in shock. They had never seen an army of this size. Their leader, Abu Sufyan ibn Harb, rode out to investigate. When he reached the hills, the sight filled him with awe. He soon encountered Al-Abbas, the Prophet's uncle, who guided him to the Muslim camp. There, Abu Sufyan stood face to face with the man he had opposed for nearly 20 years. The Prophet asked him, "Has the time not come for you to recognize that there is no God but Allah?" At that moment, the leader of Quraysh accepted Islam. Mecca's leader had surrendered. At the first light of dawn, groups of silhouettes are gathering their gear and mounting camels. The sky is a soft gray and violet. Massive, controlled movement. Each column approached Mecca from a different direction, but the Prophet gave a clear command: do not fight unless you are attacked. Instead of marching proudly like a conqueror, the Prophet rode his camel with his head bowed in humility. He quietly recited verses from the Quran describing victory. As the army entered the city, something remarkable happened. At the center of Mecca stood the Kaaba. For centuries, it had been surrounded by idols. Nearly 360 statues filled the sanctuary. One by one, the Prophet pointed toward them with his staff while reciting the words of the Quran from Surah Al-Isra. As the verse was recited, the idols were removed and destroyed. The Kaaba was purified. Then the Prophet called for one man, Bilal ibn Rabah. Bilal climbed to the top of the Kaaba. A former slave who had once been tortured in this very city was now standing atop its most sacred site. And for the first time, the call to prayer echoed across the valley of Mecca. The sound reached the hearts of those who had once been enemies. The people of Mecca gathered in fear. For years they had fought against the Muslims. Many expected revenge. The Prophet looked at the crowd. "O people of Quraysh, what do you think I will do with you today?" They answered carefully, "You are a noble brother, the son of a noble brother." Then the Prophet repeated the words of Yusuf, "There is no blame upon you today." Then he declared, "Go, you are all free." The conquest became known for mercy. Soon afterward, the meaning of this victory became clear. People across Arabia began entering Islam in large numbers, as reflected in the words of Surah An-Nasr. Mecca was no longer the enemy. It had become the heart of the Muslim world. But the story was not yet finished. Beyond the mountains, new tribes were gathering. Soon, another battle would unfold in the valley of Hunayn. The conquest of Mecca had changed Arabia forever. For the first time, the city that once led the opposition against Islam had opened its gates without a fight. The Kaaba had been purified. The idols were gone. But victory in the desert often creates new enemies. Beyond the mountains, two powerful tribes were watching with growing concern, Hawazin and Thaqif. To them, the rise of Islam was not simply a new faith. It was a threat to the old order of Arabia, so they made a bold decision. They would not wait for the Muslims to come to them. They would strike first. Their battlefield would be a narrow and dangerous pass known as the Valley of Hunayn. And what happened there would become one of the greatest tests of faith in early Islamic history. After the conquest of Mecca, the Muslim army had grown larger than ever before. Nearly 12,000 soldiers now marched under the leadership of Prophet Muhammad. Among them were 2,000 newly converted men from Quraysh. It was the largest Muslim army ever assembled. As they marched toward Hunayn, some soldiers looked around at the massive force surrounding them. For the first time in their history, they were not outnumbered. Some among them said with confidence, "Today we will not be defeated because of small numbers." In earlier battles like the Battle of Badr, the Muslims had relied completely on faith despite overwhelming odds. But now, something new had appeared. Confidence in numbers, and history was about to test that confidence. The opposing army was commanded by a young but determined leader, Malik ibn Auf al-Nasri. Malik understood the terrain better than anyone. The valley of Hunayn was narrow, surrounded by steep rocky slopes, perfect for an ambush. But Malik did something even more unusual. He ordered his warriors to bring their families, their livestock, and their wealth with them to the battlefield. Many elders questioned this decision, but Malik answered firmly, "If a man knows his family and wealth are behind him, he will fight with everything he has." Before dawn, his warriors spread out across the valley, archers hid among the rocks, spearmen waited behind ridges. The trap was ready. Just before sunrise, the Muslim army began descending into the valley. The air was cool and quiet. Visibility was low. Suddenly, the silence exploded. War cries echoed across the mountains. From every ridge, arrows rained down upon the army. The ambush was devastating. Horses panicked. Men struggled to see their attackers. The narrow valley quickly became a place of confusion and chaos. Within moments, parts of the Muslim army began retreating. The force that had marched confidently into the valley was now facing its greatest test. The chaos at Hunayn became so significant that it was later mentioned in the Quran. These words describe the moment when the Muslims were impressed by their own numbers. Yet those numbers could not save them. The earth itself seemed to close in around them, and many turned back in retreat. It was a powerful reminder that victory never comes from numbers alone. While many soldiers were retreating, one figure remained firmly in place. Prophet Muhammad did not withdraw. Riding his mule, he moved toward the enemy lines. Around him stood a small group of loyal companions, including Abu Bakr, Umar ibn al-Khattab, and Ali ibn Abi Talib. Beside him stood his uncle, Al-Abbas. With courage and certainty, the Prophet called out, "I am the Prophet, and this is no lie. I am the son of Abdul Muttalib." Then Al-Abbas used his powerful voice to call the army back. "O companions of the tree, O people of Surah Al-Baqarah." Hearing the call of their oath and faith, the companions began turning back. One by one, they returned to the battlefield. As the companions regrouped, the momentum of the battle began to shift. The Muslims launched a new charge against the enemy lines. The Prophet picked up a handful of dust and cast it toward the enemy while praying for victory. Soon the Hawazin warriors began to lose their formation. The ambushers who had once controlled the valley were now retreating. Malik ibn Auf's plan had failed. The very families and livestock he had brought to motivate his army now slowed their escape. The Battle of Hunayn had turned from near disaster into victory. The battle was over, but the war was not yet finished. Many of the defeated warriors fled toward their fortified city, Taif. Soon the Muslim army would march there and begin a difficult siege. But the Battle of Hunayn left behind an unforgettable lesson. It reminded the believers that strength is not measured by numbers. True victory comes from faith, unity, and perseverance. The Valley of Hunayn had tested the believers and prepared them for the next chapter, the coming siege of Taif. The dust of the battle in the Valley of Hunayn had barely settled. The defeated warriors of Hawazin and Thaqif were fleeing south through the rugged mountains. But the war for Arabia was not over. Their destination was a city unlike any other in the peninsula. High in the mountains, surrounded by fertile land and thick stone defenses, a city known for its wealth, its vineyards, and its powerful walls. That city was Taif. The Muslims had won their victories in open deserts and valleys, but now they faced something far more difficult. A fortified city prepared to survive a long siege. This would not be a battle of speed, it would be a battle of patience. This is the story of the siege of Taif. Taif was one of the most prosperous cities in Arabia. While much of the peninsula suffered from heat and drought, Taif enjoyed cooler mountain air and fertile land. Its orchards and vineyards were famous across the region. The city was controlled by the powerful tribe of Thaqif. But what truly protected Taif were its massive defensive walls. Unlike the mud structures common in other towns, these defenses were built from heavy stone. Strong gates and high towers allowed archers to defend the city from above. Inside the walls, the defenders had stored food, water, and supplies for many months. Their commander, Malik ibn Auf al-Nasri, had retreated here after the defeat at Hunayn. He understood one important fact. As long as those gates remained closed, the city could survive. Soon, the army led by Prophet Muhammad arrived outside the city. Nearly 12,000 soldiers had marched from Hunayn. At first, the camp was established close to the walls, but the defenders quickly demonstrated the danger. Arrows rained down from the towers with deadly accuracy. Several companions were killed in the opening moments of the siege. The camp was moved farther away from the walls to a safer location. The siege of Taif had officially begun. But the defenders held the advantage. They could watch the attackers from above while remaining protected behind stone. The Muslims soon realized that traditional battlefield tactics would not break the walls of Taif, so new technology was introduced. For the first time in their campaigns, siege weapons were used. Large catapults, known as manjanik, were assembled. Heavy stones were launched toward the city walls. Some companions who had knowledge of siege warfare helped construct these machines. Huge rocks crashed into the battlements. The sound echoed through the valley. But the defenders of Taif were prepared. They repaired damage quickly. The walls remained standing. Next, the Muslim army attempted a more direct assault. They built protective wooden structures called dababa. These were covered shelters that allowed soldiers to move toward the base of the walls while shielded from arrows. The plan was simple: reach the walls, dig into the foundations, and weaken the defenses from below. But the defenders of Taif responded with brutal ingenuity. They heated metal until it glowed red. Then they dropped the burning metal down through openings above the attackers. The wooden shelters caught fire. The soldiers beneath them were forced to retreat quickly. Once again, the fortress of Taif remained unbroken. The defenders believed the siege would soon collapse. From the safety of the walls, they watched the attackers withdraw once again. As the siege continued, another strategy was considered. The wealth of Taif came from its fertile vineyards. These fields were the pride of the city. The prophet ordered that some of these vines be cut. It was a clear signal to the defenders that the siege could threaten their prosperity. The people of Taif cried out from the walls, asking that their lands not be destroyed. In response, the order was soon given to stop. Even during war, destruction was not the goal. At the same time, another announcement was made. Any slave who escaped the city and joined the Muslims would be granted freedom. Several slaves climbed down from the walls that night. They confirmed what many suspected. The city still had enough supplies to last a long time. Days turned into weeks. The siege lasted nearly 20 days. The defenders showed no sign of surrender. A companion named Nawfal ibn Muawiyah offered a comparison. The people of Thaqif are like a fox inside its hole. If you stay, you may catch it, but if you leave, it cannot harm you. Around this time, the prophet also saw a dream. He interpreted it as a sign that the conquest of Taif was not destined at that moment. Soon the decision was made. The siege would end. As the Muslim army began preparing to withdraw, some companions asked for a curse against the people of Taif. They had caused many injuries during the siege. But the response was very different. The prophet raised his hands in prayer and said, "O Allah, guide the people of Thaqif and bring them to us." It was not revenge he wanted, it was guidance. History would prove that this prayer was powerful. Within a year, leaders of Taif would travel to Medina and accept Islam peacefully. The fortress that could not be conquered by force was opened by patience. The siege of Taif marked the final major conflict in Arabia that year. But beyond the borders of the peninsula, larger powers were beginning to notice the rise of the new Muslim state. But beyond Arabia, a new threat was rising. To the north, the armies of the Roman world were watching. The next journey would lead across burning deserts, to the frontier of the Byzantine Empire. And the next chapter of the story begins with the expedition of Tabuk. The year was 630 CE. Arabia had entered a new chapter of its history. Only months earlier, the idols that had stood for generations inside the Kaaba were removed. Soon after, the tribes that had resisted were defeated at Hunayn, and in the mountains, the long confrontation of the siege of Taif had come to an end. Across Arabia, tribes were beginning to recognize the authority of the growing Muslim community centered in Medina. But beyond the deserts, another power was watching. To the north stood the vast and ancient Byzantine Empire. For centuries, Roman armies had dominated the lands surrounding Arabia. Now rumors spread through caravans and travelers. Roman forces were gathering near the frontier. If the new state were to survive, it could no longer remain isolated. In earlier campaigns, military plans were often kept secret, but this expedition would be different. The destination was announced openly. The army would march north toward a remote desert frontier known as Tabuk. The journey would be nearly 700 kilometers across the harshest terrain on Earth. It was not simply a military expedition, it was a test of faith, endurance, and unity. And the one who called for this march was Prophet Muhammad. The timing could hardly have been more difficult. The call to march came during the peak of summer. In Medina, the orchards were filled with ripe dates. Shade was precious. Water was limited. For many, leaving their homes now meant abandoning comfort at the most difficult moment of the year. Yet the call was clear. 30,000 men would prepare to march north. This army would become known as Jaysh al-Usra, the Army of Hardship. Preparing such a large force required immense resources: food, animals, weapons, armor. The treasury of the young community was small. But the response was legendary. Umar ibn al-Khattab brought half of everything he owned, hoping that on this day he might surpass his close friend. Soon after came Abu Bakr. When asked what he had left for his family, he replied calmly, "I have left for them Allah and His Messenger." But the greatest financial support came from Uthman ibn Affan. He provided hundreds of camels fully equipped for travel. He supplied horses. And he placed 1,000 gold dinars before the Prophet. The Prophet remarked with admiration that nothing Uthman would do afterward could harm him. Even the poorest came forward. Some wept because they had nothing to offer and no animal to ride. Their sincerity would later be remembered in Revelation. But not everyone welcomed the call. Among the population were individuals known as the munafiqun, the hypocrites. They spread doubt quietly. They told people, "Do not march in this heat." They warned of Roman armies and the dangers of the journey. Many excuses were made. Yet among those who stayed behind were 3 sincere believers: Ka'b ibn Malik, Murara ibn al-Rabi, and Hilal ibn Umayyah. They did not reject the expedition, but they delayed. At last, the army began its journey. 30,000 men, the largest force ever assembled in Arabia at that time. The suffering began immediately. Many soldiers shared a single camel. One man would ride for a short distance, then step down so another could take his place. Water was scarce. Food was limited. At times, the army was forced to slaughter camels simply to drink. Yet the march continued, day after day, across burning sand and endless horizons. During the march, the army passed through Al-Hijrah. These ruins were associated with the ancient people of Thamud. The Prophet instructed the army not to drink from the wells there. It was a place remembered for divine punishment. Even during war, the companions were reminded of lessons from history. Water supplies were nearly exhausted. As the journey continued, the army began to suffer extreme thirst. At that moment, the Prophet prayed for relief. Authentic narrations describe that clouds soon gathered. Rain fell until every container was filled. The army was refreshed. Yet beyond the boundaries of the camp, the surrounding land remained dry, a moment they would never forget. After weeks of exhausting travel, the army finally reached the frontier region of Tabuk. They prepared for battle. Weapons were sharpened. Scouts scanned the horizon. But something unexpected happened. No Roman army appeared. The forces of the Byzantine Empire had withdrawn. The determination of the army had already achieved its objective. The Prophet remained in Tabuk for nearly 20 days. Leaders from nearby regions approached seeking peaceful agreements. Treaties were signed with the rulers of Ayla, Jarba, and Adru. The northern frontier of Arabia was now under the influence of Medina. The expedition had ended without a battle, but its impact was profound. The army began its long journey back to Medina. The Muslim state had demonstrated its ability to challenge even the greatest empires. But for some, the trial was just beginning. For the 3 companions who had stayed behind, the return marked the beginning of a trial. The community was instructed to avoid them. For 50 days, they lived in isolation. Finally, revelation came announcing that their repentance had been accepted. The city of Medina rejoiced. Their story became a lasting lesson about honesty and repentance. The expedition of Tabuk was the final military expedition personally led by the Prophet. It proved that the community could endure hardship together. Strength is measured in perseverance. Within a year, tribes from every corner of Arabia would travel to Medina to accept Islam peacefully. Historians would remember this as the Year of Delegations. The Army of Hardship had opened the final chapter, and ahead, another historic moment was approaching: the farewell pilgrimage. The year was 631 CE, the 9th year after the migration to Medina. Only a decade earlier, the Muslim community had been a small group of refugees escaping persecution in Mecca. Yet within 10 short years, the entire political landscape of Arabia had been transformed. The idols of the Kaaba had fallen. The tribes that attempted resistance were defeated at Hunayn. And the difficult northern expedition known as the Expedition of Tabuk had demonstrated something the desert had never seen before: a united Arabian army marching to the frontier of the Byzantine Empire. No battle had occurred, but the message had been delivered. Arabia had entered a new era. Historians would later give this moment a name, Am al-Wufud, the Year of Delegations. For generations, the Arabian Peninsula had been a world of shifting alliances and endless tribal feuds. Power belonged to whichever tribe could dominate the desert routes. But the events of recent years had shattered this fragile balance. The victory of the Muslims had not been limited to military success. It had created something far more powerful, a new political and spiritual center in Medina. The expedition to Tabuk had been particularly significant. 30,000 men had marched north toward the Roman frontier. And when the Roman forces chose not to confront them, the message spread quickly. If even the Romans hesitated, what chance did smaller tribes have? One by one, the leaders of Arabia began to reconsider. Among the earliest to arrive was the powerful tribe of Banu Tamim, known throughout Arabia for their pride, eloquence, and fierce independence. They did not approach Medina quietly. Instead, they stood outside the homes of the Prophet calling out loudly, demanding recognition of their tribal honor. In the culture of Arabia, prestige was often measured through poetry and public speaking. The delegation brought their most skilled orator, Utarid ibn Hajib. Standing before the gathering, he began to boast of the greatness of his tribe, their wealth, their warriors, and their noble ancestry. But the Prophet responded differently. He turned to the poet Hassan ibn Thabit and the speaker Thabit ibn Qais. They answered not with tribal arrogance, but with words praising the Creator. The impact was immediate. The leaders of Banu Tamim exchanged glances, and one of them quietly admitted, "His speaker is more eloquent than ours, and his poet surpasses ours." Soon after, many embraced Islam. During this remarkable year, Medina became the diplomatic heart of Arabia. Delegations arrived almost weekly. Caravans filled the roads leading into the oasis. Visitors came from distant regions, the mountains of Yemen, the deserts of Najd, and the coastal territories along the Red Sea. Inside the mosque, the Prophet welcomed them all. Kings and shepherds alike sat together in the same courtyard. There were no thrones, no royal ceremonies, only discussions about faith, justice, and the future of Arabia. Many delegations accepted Islam immediately. Others formed alliances and signed peace treaties. Every meeting strengthened the stability of the peninsula. One of the most dramatic delegations came from the tribe of Thaqif. Only a year earlier they had defended their city during the intense conflict of the siege of Ta'if. Their city had been one of the final strongholds of resistance. Now their leaders entered Medina cautiously. Unlike other delegations, they arrived with demands. They asked to keep their idol Al-Lat for several more years. They requested exemption from daily prayers. But the Prophet remained firm. Faith could not exist without prayer. Gradually, the leaders of Thaqif understood. If Arabia was truly changing, they would need to change with it. Eventually, they accepted Islam. Soon after, the idols of Ta'if were dismantled. Not every delegation came to accept Islam. One of the most famous arrived from the Christian community of Najran. Scholars, nobles, and clergy came to discuss theology, specifically the nature of Jesus, known in Islam as Isa. Even though they disagreed on belief, the Prophet treated them with respect and allowed them to perform their own prayers. Eventually, a treaty was signed guaranteeing their protection, their churches, their property. It became an early example of formal agreement between Muslims and a Christian community. For centuries, an Arab's identity had been defined by tribe alone. You defended your tribe whether it was right or wrong. But during this year, something extraordinary happened. Old rivalries faded. Men who once fought now stood side by side in prayer. A new identity had emerged. Not tribe, not lineage, but a shared faith, the birth of the Ummah. By the end of the year, the transformation was nearly complete. Delegations had arrived from nearly every corner. Treaties signed, conflicts resolved. A message that began with a handful of believers had now reached the entire land, and the man who had carried that message knew that his mission was nearing its final chapter. Soon, he would call for one last journey, a pilgrimage to the sacred sanctuary in Mecca, where he would deliver a message remembered forever as the farewell sermon. The Year of Delegations marked the moment when Arabia chose unity. The era of tribal warfare was ending. A new civilization had begun to rise. But one final message remained, a message not only for the tribes of Arabia, but for all of humanity. The year was 632 CE. More than 20 years had passed since a moment inside a quiet cave changed the course of history. What began as a single revelation delivered to one man outside the city of Mecca had grown into a movement that reshaped an entire civilization. The early believers had endured persecution, exile, and war. They had been forced to migrate through the desert to the oasis city of Medina. There, against overwhelming odds, they built a new community based on faith, justice, and unity. But the path to that stability had been long and difficult. Battles had tested their survival. Alliances had shifted. Entire tribes had risen against them. Yet slowly, year after year, the message continued to spread. The idols that once filled the sanctuary of the Kaaba were destroyed during the historic conquest of Mecca. The fierce resistance of tribes collapsed after Hunayn, and the northern march of Tabuk demonstrated a united Arabian force marching together. For the first time in centuries, the endless tribal conflicts were beginning to fade. Arabia was changing, and now another historic moment was approaching. Prophet Muhammad announced that he would perform the pilgrimage, the journey to the sacred sanctuary in Mecca. The news traveled across the desert with astonishing speed. Messengers carried the announcement from tribe to tribe. Travelers repeated the message in markets. Within weeks, preparations began across the entire peninsula. People understood that this pilgrimage would be different. Many believed this might be the final opportunity to travel beside the messenger of Allah, and so, from every horizon, the caravans began to move. Across the deserts of Arabia, roads that once carried merchants were now filled with pilgrims. Men, women, and families began their journeys toward Mecca. Some came from the mountains of Yemen. Others traveled from the rocky plateaus of Najd. Caravans formed in distant valleys and along coastal trade routes. Each group carried the same purpose: to witness the pilgrimage alongside Prophet Muhammad. By the time they reached Medina, the gathering was extraordinary. Historians estimate that tens of thousands had assembled. The city that once sheltered a small community of refugees was now the center of a massive movement. From Medina, the great caravan departed. The procession stretched across the desert like a moving river. Dust rose as thousands of footsteps crossed the sands. For many, this journey carried deep meaning. Years earlier, they left as exiles. Now they were returning peacefully as a united community. The transformation was remarkable. The tribes that once fought endless wars were now traveling together. The desert that once echoed with battle now carried the quiet rhythm of pilgrimage. Although most of Arabia had embraced Islam, remnants of the old world still remained. For centuries, the tribes had worshipped idols of stone and wood. Each tribe maintained its own sacred symbols for protection and power. But with the spread of Islam, this ancient system of belief was collapsing. Delegations had traveled to Medina during the Year of Delegations. Tribes across Arabia pledged loyalty and embraced the new faith. Still, a few temples remained. The Prophet sent trusted companions to remove these final symbols of the past. Across the peninsula, the last idols were brought down. Temples were abandoned. It was more than a religious change. It marked the end of an entire era. The age of tribal gods was fading. A new spiritual identity was taking shape. As the pilgrimage approached, Arabia stood on the edge of a historic transformation. For the first time, the people of the desert were united by a single belief. After days of travel across the desert, the great caravan finally approached the sacred valley. The city of Mecca appeared between the surrounding mountains. For many of the companions walking alongside the Prophet, this moment carried powerful memories. Years earlier, they had been driven from this city. They had left behind homes, businesses, and family ties. Yet history had taken a different path. The message of Islam had continued to grow despite every obstacle. As the caravan entered the valley, thousands of voices echoed through the desert with a single declaration: Labbaik Allahumma labbaik. Here I am, O Allah, here I am. The sound of the pilgrim's call spread across the mountains. All wealth, status, and tribal identity were left behind. Every pilgrim walked the same path. At the center of this historic gathering was the messenger of Allah, Prophet Muhammad. He had returned to the city where the mission began. But this journey would be unlike any before it, because this pilgrimage would soon become known in history as the Farewell Pilgrimage. At the heart of Mecca stood the Kaaba, the ancient sanctuary built by the Prophet Ibrahim centuries earlier. For generations, it had been surrounded by idols. But the old world had already begun to disappear. During the conquest of Mecca 2 years earlier, the idols had been destroyed. Now the sanctuary stood purified. As the pilgrims entered the sacred mosque, tens of thousands of believers began the first ritual, tawaf. Wave after wave of pilgrims circled the sacred structure. Each person carried their own story. Some had once fought against the Prophet before embracing Islam, but now they stood together in unity. Only faith remained. The pilgrimage continued with rituals that connected the believers to ancient history. Pilgrims walked between the hills of Safa and Marwa. This journey honored the struggle of Hajjar. Centuries earlier, she had run between these same hills searching for water. Her faith was rewarded with the spring of Zamzam. Now, thousands of years later, the pilgrims repeated this journey, walking the same path, remembering the same story. Each step carried meaning. Through these acts, the Prophet was teaching the community how to perform the pilgrimage properly. Many companions observed every action carefully. They knew that this journey might be the last time they would witness the Prophet performing these sacred rites. So they memorized every detail. They understood that future generations would follow this example. The pilgrimage was not only a spiritual journey, it was a lesson that would guide millions. As the days of the pilgrimage continued, the caravan of believers moved toward the wide open plain known as Arafat. This barren valley lies just outside the city of Mecca. On the 9th day of the pilgrimage, the entire gathering traveled there together. The crowd spread across the desert in every direction. Some climbed the gentle slopes of the hill. Others remained in the open plains. Everywhere there were people. Historians estimate that more than 100,000 believers had assembled for the pilgrimage that year. It was the largest gathering of Muslims that had ever taken place. Only a generation earlier, the tribes of Arabia had been divided by war and rivalry. Now those same tribes stood together in the same valley, united by a single faith, united by a single purpose. In the center of this historic gathering stood the messenger of Allah, Prophet Muhammad. From the back of his camel, he prepared to address the enormous crowd before him. The desert fell silent, because everyone present understood that they were about to hear words that would shape the future of their civilization. The Prophet began to speak. His voice carried across the desert through a chain of companions repeating his words so that the message could reach every corner of the gathering. He reminded the people of the sacredness of human life. Just as the city of Mecca is sacred, just as the days of pilgrimage are sacred, so too are the lives and property of believers. No person had the right to harm another unjustly. The old traditions of revenge that once dominated tribal life were now abolished. Blood feuds that had lasted generations were declared finished. The Prophet explained that the era of ignorance, the age known as Jahiliyyah, had come to an end. The system of tribal arrogance and oppression would no longer define society. Justice would replace revenge. Responsibility would replace pride. The message was clear. A new moral order had been established, one built on faith and accountability before God. As the sermon continued, the Prophet delivered one of the most important declarations in the history of Arabia. For centuries, society in the desert had been defined by tribal hierarchy. Lineage and ancestry were treated as measures of human worth, but the Prophet rejected this system completely. He declared to the crowd that all human beings come from the same origin, from Adam and Eve. No Arab is superior to a non-Arab. No white person is superior to a black person, except through righteousness and character. These words echoed across the desert valley. For many listening, the message was revolutionary. The tribal divisions that once defined their world were being replaced with a new identity, the identity of faith, a community that transcended bloodlines and geography, the Ummah. The Prophet continued to deliver guidance to the gathering. He reminded them to treat women with kindness and respect. He warned against injustice and exploitation. He spoke about financial responsibility and the prohibition of interests that harmed the vulnerable. The message emphasized fairness and accountability in every part of life. He then reminded the believers to hold firmly to the teachings that had been revealed. The Quran, the guidance that had shaped the community through years of hardship and struggle. Finally, the Prophet asked the people a question that carried deep meaning for everyone present. Have I delivered the message? The crowd responded with one voice, yes. The valley echoed with their answer. Then the Prophet raised his finger toward the sky and said, "O Allah, bear witness." At that moment, many companions felt something profound. They realized that the mission that began more than 20 years earlier was now complete. As the sermon came to its conclusion, a moment occurred that many companions would remember for the rest of their lives. During the pilgrimage, a verse of the Quran was revealed that signaled the completion of the mission. اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا. Today I have perfected for you your religion, completed my favor upon you, and have chosen Islam as your religion. For over 2 decades, revelation had guided the community through moments of hardship and triumph. Verses had been revealed during times of persecution in Mecca. Others came during battles, treaties, and migrations. Each revelation brought guidance for the growing Muslim community. But this verse carried a different message. It spoke of completion, of fulfillment. Many companions felt a deep sense of reflection when they heard it. Some even sensed that the life mission of the Prophet was approaching its final chapter. Among them was the companion Umar ibn al-Khattab. Years later, he would recall the moment when this verse was revealed. He understood that if the religion had been perfected, then the earthly mission of the messenger who delivered it was nearing its end. Yet on that day, the valley of Arafat was filled not with sadness, but with gratitude, because the community had witnessed the completion of a message that had changed the course of history. As the sun set over the plain of Arafat, the pilgrims began the next stage of the journey. The great gathering slowly moved toward the valley of Muzdalifah. Torches and campfires illuminated the desert night as thousands of believers rested beneath the open sky. The following morning, the pilgrims continued toward Mina. There they performed another symbolic act of the pilgrimage, the stoning of the pillars that represent the rejection of evil. This ritual commemorates the story of the Prophet Ibrahim resisting the temptations of Satan. Each stone thrown by the pilgrims symbolized a rejection of arrogance, temptation, and wrongdoing. The journey of the pilgrimage was filled with meaning. Every ritual connected the believers to the history of faith, and every moment reminded them of the lessons carried by the prophets who came before. Throughout these events, the companions carefully observed the actions of the Prophet. They memorized the order of the rituals. They watched how he prayed, how he spoke, and how he guided the people. They understood that these actions would become the example followed by generations of Muslims in the centuries to come. After completing the major rites of the pilgrimage, the believers returned once again to the sacred sanctuary. The courtyard of the Kaaba remained filled with pilgrims performing tawaf. Day and night, the flow of believers continued. The sight was extraordinary. Only a few decades earlier, this same sanctuary had been surrounded by idols and tribal rivalries. Now it had become the center of a unified community of believers. During these final days in Mecca, the Prophet continued teaching and guiding the people. He clarified the rituals of the pilgrimage. He reminded them of the principles of justice and compassion, and he encouraged the community to remain united after his time. Many companions spent these moments reflecting on how dramatically their world had changed. They had witnessed the transformation of Arabia within a single generation. A society once divided by tribal warfare had become a community united by faith. And at the center of that transformation stood the messenger of Allah, Prophet Muhammad. Eventually, the pilgrimage came to an end. The believers prepared to leave the sacred city. Caravans began forming once again across the valley. Thousands of travelers would soon return to their homes throughout the Arabian Peninsula, but this journey home felt different, because the companions understood that they had witnessed something historic. They had seen the completion of the message that had reshaped their lives. As the caravan departed the valley of Mecca, many pilgrims carried a deep sense of responsibility. The message they had heard was now entrusted to them. They would carry it to their families, to their tribes, and to future generations. The unity created during the pilgrimage would soon spread far beyond the deserts of Arabia. The farewell pilgrimage marked the final great gathering led by the messenger of Allah. Within a short time after returning to Medina, the life of the Prophet would come to its end. But the message he delivered did not end with him. From the deserts of Arabia, the teachings of Islam would travel across continents, through trade routes, scholarship, and generations of believers. The principles declared during the final sermon would echo throughout history: justice, equality, responsibility, and faith in the one God. What began with a single revelation had grown into a civilization that would influence the world for centuries. And the words spoken on the plain of Arafat would remain among the most powerful messages ever delivered to humanity.